Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Once again, welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. I hope everyone is refreshed from finishing out 2018 and moving strongly into 2019. And I'm looking forward to 2019. I know people have mixed feelings about it. I'm very hopeful about it. And today's show is really kind of kicking off, I think, how we need to go into 2019 so we don't burn out in the first month. So you don't crash and burn the first month. And it's the age-old question of, how do you find your voice to fight racism? And as I was reflecting over the show over the holidays and taking a little break to rest and rejuvenate, I was thinking, okay, do we still need a show about racism? Doesn't everybody get it by now? Because when you live in this world like I do and you breathe it in and day out, you kind of think, okay, everybody's got it. And then sure enough, something happens that you go, okay, I guess we still need to have these conversations, and we need to figure out how we can have these conversations and communicate with each other in a way that's safe and open and productive. So the show, this particular show is going to really focus in on, some tips for you. I posted in the Facebook group page. So if you're not a member or if you haven't liked that page, please do, because that's really where I post a lot of things relevant to the race conversation. And what I posted today that we're going to get into is kind of what role are you playing, if any, yet in the race reconciliation journey? And if you are and have been, kind of where are you on this spectrum? And it's entitled, What's My Role Today? And the person that created it, I'll get into that, Deepa Iyer, Iyer. We'll get into that. But in answering the question, do we still need to have these conversations? Do we still have problems communicating? Do we still have stereotypes? In other words, do we still have issues? Whether you're black or white, do we still have issues about talking about racism in this country? It's a lot easier, it seems, to talk about, female equality, or LGBTQ equality, or how we need to address each other as it relates to the millennials or the next generation. There's so many other issues that seems to be easier to talk about, but for me, at the end of the day, if we're not addressing the issue of racism and how it has impacted this country and is still impacting this country, we're really not going to get anywhere. We'll see incremental improvements in one area, but the wheels are coming off in a different area. So it's important for those of us that are waking up to this journey or have been involved in this journey for a period of time that we really know where we are, what our roles are, and how to take care of ourselves. So we're going to get into that as part of today's show. But so I have to bring up this one incident that happened at the end of December. And you probably heard about this. It was at a hotel in Portland. Not going to mention the name, and that's a good reminder for me to just mention at this point in time that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So I just want to get that in there. But so this particular incident, it happened at a hotel in Portland from a person that was sitting in the lobby. And they talk about what he was wearing, athletic shoes, jeans, and a hoodie. And his feet were propped up on the couch. Well, that's kind of the first thing that struck me, kind of like, okay, why is his feet on the couch? I think that's rude, but then that's just me. And it goes on to say he just returned from a concert and received an unexpected call from his mother. And rather than heading upstairs to his room, he took it in the lobby to take the call. And after a few minutes on the phone, a hotel security guard approached him and asked if he was a guest. So it goes on to say that this gentleman was annoyed and asked the guard to leave him alone. Well, whether we like it or not, in my opinion, when you are a person of color, you kind of already know what category you're going to be placed into. And I'm not saying that's fair and that's the way it should be. But unfortunately, that's the reality of the world we live in the United States, and not to mention globally. So the guard asked him again if he was a guest at the hotel, and the gentleman answered yes. Then he asked him the room number, and the response was, well, I don't remember my room number. And he attempted to continue his conversation, but the security guard radioed the manager on duty to call 911. So the manager came over and asked what was going on. And the next thing you knew, the police, had been called. The manager asked if he was a guest. And at that particular point in time, the gentleman pulled out his room key envelope with his room number written on it. So the question becomes, well, why didn't you do that at the beginning? We should all be aware that anytime we're approaching someone of a different race, and you guys that listen to the show know how much I hate the word race, and because it's a created category. We're all one human being, one human species, but we don't treat each other that way just because how we have been programmed in this country to think of people of a certain color as being lesser than. And so as this went on, the police call was not canceled. The cops showed up, and, there was an explanation from the gentleman involved on Instagram, which is a whole nother thing. It's like we got to get past the point of just thinking we can do everything on social media to get our point across, because I can see a couple of things that, in my opinion, the gentleman was in the wrong. It's like, first of all, seriously, your feet on the sofa. I mean, would you go to somebody's house and put your feet on the sofa? Sorry if that sounds a little bit harsh and old-fashioned, but that is the reality. It's a hotel. I don't want to sit on a sofa where someone has put their feet on the sofa. And secondly, they were legitimate to ask if he was a guest at the hotel, because they, were concerned about some of the issues they were having in the neighborhood that they were in. They wanted to make sure that this person was a legitimate guest of the hotel. And as a person that stayed in, that stays in hotels, I want to make sure they're doing their due diligence also, that to make sure that the people that are there at the hotel are actually guests at the hotel. So his response, the gentleman's response on Instagram was, and this is a quote, "They already had in their minds that they didn't want me there, so I waited for the cops to show up. And when they did, I explained my side of the story, and they didn't want to hear it. They asked me if I had personal items in my room, which of course I did, and asked me to go retrieve them. They told me that since the hotel requested me to leave, that if I didn't, I would be considered a trespasser and would be thrown in jail. I complied and cooperated and was not issued a refund for my room. I packed my stuff and went to another hotel." Police offered to drive Massey to another hotel, but he refused, and he took, a lift to a nearby hotel. There was a response from the hotel management that basically said, "The safety, security, and comfort of our guests and associates is our top priority at," and they mentioned the hotel. "This incident that occurred over the holidays between our hotel and guests is unfortunate. We are sorry that this matter ended the way it did and have reached out to the gentleman in order to resolve this matter. We are a place of public accommodation and place a strong emphasis on diversity and inclusion, and our hotel does not discriminate against any individual or group. We look forward to speaking with him." So my question that I have to you is, was he right or was he wrong? Was the hotel right? Was, the hotel wrong? If you haven't, and I haven't looked at the video, I just heard about the event. And since I was on holiday, I was keeping everything pretty low key. But I in some ways hold the gentleman accountable for how his response was, because, unfortunately, as African Americans in this country, I can't think of any African American child that at some point they don't get what we refer to as the talk, and the talk is about how you respond in certain situations, especially if you get pulled over by cops, law enforcement, or whatever the situation is. And it's not necessarily fair, but at the end of the day, if you want to return to your home in one piece, or hopefully it's not happening at your home, that you are not in that situation. But that's the reality of the world we live in. And so, yes, that's why we need to continue to have these conversations about race and racism and what it does to this country when we haven't reconciled and healed about our history. And that, to me, is on both sides of the fence. So what we're going to do in today's show, we're going to take a listen to this awesome clip that I found from a comedian. That's going to be the second part of the show. The first part we're going to listen to is from somebody that really provides some good stories about how to get our heads around this whole conversation about race and how we define race and racism, and some other things that we're going to listen to. And then we'll also touch base on the picture that was posted, and I'll give you some pointers from the article that I pulled from the person that created this graphic that I think is very telling of, what's my role today? Because people always kind of want to know, at least when I'm talking to them, well, what can I do? And it's very much a difficult question for me to answer for them, because it depends on where you are in your journey. So let's start by listening to this particular clip that really gives us some insight into how we come across and how we present ourselves, or our point of view, based on which side of the fence we're on in this conversation about race and racism.
Hello, everybody. Wow, there are people up in the balcony, too. I am delighted to be here today. You've heard that I'm in health, and a lot of my work is on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. But what I'm going to do today is empower all of us with tools for communicating about race and racism. I see the world.
So just to let you know, you're listening to Dr. Camara Jones, and she's going to share 4 allegories on race and racism, and this is from a TED Talk that she gave. So I may pause it in between, but I did want to back up and let you know who you're listening to.
In allegories. Sometimes I just look at an ordinary situation and I get some insight about how to communicate about very complex ideas. So today I'm going to share with you 4 allegories on race and racism that I hope you will understand, remember, and then pass them on. The first story, Japanese Lanterns, Colored Perceptions, was sparked by my own real experience back in the day when I was at this very nice garden party in the evening in California. And I had my turn with chitting and chatting, and I was just sort of tired, and I wanted to just sit back in the corner of the garden and relax and listen to the conversation and music just wash over me. And as I sat there in the garden, I became fascinated by a group of pink moths. And then I looked a little further on and I saw a group of green moths and a group of blue moths. And so not only was I fascinated by that, I was fascinated by how they naturally were sorting according to their kind. And then I looked over my shoulder and I saw, wow, and there's some yellow moths and some purple moths and some orange moths too. And the scientist in me was getting very excited about this until I was like, oh, of course. There is no such thing as purple or pink or blue or green or yellow or orange moths. Moths are different colors, yes. but they're different colors of brown and tan and speckled and splotched. But the colors that I thought I was seeing and the colors that we think we see every day are actually due to the lights by which we look. These colored lights distort and mask our own true variability, which can only be seen under a universal light that allows all possibility. So when I remembered this image, I started thinking, what is race? And how do the racial categories that we construct color our imaginations of who we are? And in my mind, race is clearly a social classification, not a biological descriptor. It is the social interpretation of how one looks in a race-conscious society. So here in Atlanta, in the United States, by the colored lights that we look at, I'm clearly black. But in some parts of Brazil, with different colored lights, I'm clearly colored, clearly white, actually. And in South Africa, I'm clearly colored. And so we need to challenge ourselves to understand the impact of these different colored racial categories that we construct and how it's limiting our understanding of our own true variability. The second story, Dual Reality, a restaurant saga, this was also from my time back as a medical student in California. And I had been studying with some friends. It was getting late. We'd missed dinner. And so we went into town to get something to eat. And we walk into a restaurant, and we sit down, we order our food. Our food is served, and here we are eating. And that's not remarkable. Many of you have had that experience. And I wouldn't have thought anything more about it or be talking about it today, except that I looked up and I noticed a sign. And that sign was provided me a profound insight about racism. So what did the sign say? The sign said open. Now, I could have thought nothing more about that, right? I was sitting at the table of opportunity eating with a sign that proclaimed open to me. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I realized that in fact, people who were hungry but just a few feet away from me on the other side of the sign would not be able to come in because in fact now the restaurant was closed due to the hour. And I realized that racism and other systems of inequity structure open-closed signs in our society. And it's important for us to know something about the two-sided nature of these signs. It's important for us to understand how these signs, how racism and all of the other isms create a dual reality, where on one side, people who are in the side, for any of us, it's difficult for us to recognize any system of inequity that is privileging us. So, for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white people in this country to recognize white privilege and racism. It's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the world context. Yet, for those on the other side of the sign, they are very well aware of the two-sided nature of the sign. Because it's proclaiming close to them, and yet they can see through the window and see that people are eating on the other side. So back inside the restaurant, I understand that people might ask, does racism really exist? Is there really a two-sided sign? Because in fact, it's hard to know when all you ever see is open. It's a privilege, in fact, not to have to know about the two-sided nature of the sign. But once you do know, you can act. You don't have to act, but you can choose to act, and the knowledge about racism and its continued existence and profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation is actually empowering. The third of my, let me just, before I get off of that, now provide you with a definition of racism that evolves out of this understanding. And I'm really clear that racism is a system. It's not an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. But it's a system of power. And a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is that opportunity structured? And on what basis is that value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race.
So I'm going to pause right there for a minute because I want to pose a question to you. And I've asked this question in a different way earlier when I was starting the One Human Nation radio show. And so the question that I want you to think about and really contemplate over the next week is, I'm going to give both sides of this. So if you are a white person, The question for you is, how would your life have been different if you were African American and born in this country? What do you think, or how do you think your life would be different? And I want you to walk through this week with that lens on. Would this be happening to me if I was, or is there some privilege that I'm getting or benefit that I'm getting being white that I would not have if I was African American? And take a look around, whether you're in a coffee shop, whether you're in a grocery store, whether you're at work and sitting at a conference table and listening to the conversation, or you're in the break room and what's the dialogue and how are people collected and talking. So that's one part of the coin. If you're white, think about that as you go through the week. How would your life be different if you were African American and born in this country? And then on the flip side of this, I want to ask African Americans born in this country, how would your life have been different if you were born white? What would you be doing differently, or where would you be different or differently on the spectrum of economics if you were born as a white person in this country? Now, let me just say that doesn't mean that we all don't have to work hard. Okay, that is not what that means. I totally get that. But this is about how do we start looking at the world through a different lens so that we can have better communication. And so let's continue listening to Dr. Jones as she talks about and breaks down some of these perceptions that we have about race and racism based on these stories that she's sharing with you. So let's continue listening.
And what are the impacts of this system of power? Well, it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, but it doesn't take very long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that it's also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And then even as it's unfairly disadvantaging or advantaging individuals and communities, this system is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. My third story, Levels of Racism, A Gardener's Tale, comes from my experience when my husband and I, newlywed, bought our first freestanding house with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes all along the porch. Now, when we went to plant our marigold seeds, we saw some of the boxes had dirt in them and some of the boxes were empty. So my husband dutifully goes to the gardening store and he's hauling big old bags of potting soil, and we fill up the empty boxes and we put equal numbers of seeds in all of the boxes. And we water all of the boxes. And I'm not the gardener, so I sit back, just going to enjoy. And 3 weeks later, I walk out of my front door and I stopped in my tracks, because it looked to me like we had planted completely different species in some of the boxes versus others. In some of the boxes, they were full of plants, tall and vigorous looking plants, and other boxes just had a few plants in them and they were scrawny and scraggly. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil was rich, fertile soil, so that in the potting soil, every single seed had sprouted, with the strong seed growing very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed making it to a middling height. But in that old soil, that poor rocky soil that we had found there, the weak seed had died. And even the strong seed had to struggle to make it halfway up. And if you guys garden, well, maybe you've composted half of your garden and you've seen the same thing. This image is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. And I'm going to make it a story about racism. But before I do that, I want to talk to you just a little bit more about racism, because in the story, I'm going to illustrate 3 different levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. And so, sometimes I have an hour to talk about these things. I don't today, but I'm just going to quickly define each of them, make some important points, and then share the story. Institutionalized racism, what is it? It is that system that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator. This is the kind of racism that's been institutionalized in our laws and our norms, and actually often shows up as inherited disadvantage. These are some examples of how it can impact you. Sometimes people look at my top bullet of housing, education, employment, and wealth, and they ask, isn't that social class? why you have this on a slide about racism. To which I respond, it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That's not just a happenstance. But for each marginalized, oppressed, stigmatized group, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for American Indians, for example, it was the taking of the land and the genocide, and then the moving of the survivors to the reservations. For people of African descent, it was the kidnapping of West African people, and then our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people stop me there and they say, well, you know what, Dr. Jones, you're talking about slavery. But the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865, and that's fully 149 years ago now. So all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase there is all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are still what I describe as contemporary, present-day structural factors that are perpetuating the initial historical insult. And so when people ask me, am I talking about racism or social class, I say that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. Before I get off of this, I need to also say that institutionalized racism can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, and often shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So here now we're talking about what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the prejudice and the discrimination, lots of ways that it can impact your health and your whole well-being. And like institutionalized racism, it can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, but even more important, it can be unintentional as well as intentional. You don't have to intend it to have a racist impact, to do something racist to have a racist impact. Third level of racism, internalized racism, I define as acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Lots of ways that it can affect us, and it's really about accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So now, with this background about what I describe as these three levels of racism, let's go back to the story. So here I have now 2 flower boxes. But what we're going to introduce is a gardener. A gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the flowers are going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the flowers are going to produce red blossoms. And this gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil, and she takes the pink seed and she throws it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, she sees in her garden what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all of the seed is sprouted. The strong seed has grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak red seed has made it to a middling height. In the poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. And here comes the strong pink seed, just trying to make it halfway up. And then those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And then year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally, 10 years later, the gardener is looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink.
So we're going to pause right there. If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. So we're going to make a couple of announcements right here and come back and finish up listening to Dr. Jones. And then we're going to get more into the article that I want to draw to your attention, and it's entitled Saying Goodbye to 2018 Seesaw of Outrage and Numbness. And the author of that I mentioned earlier is Deepa Iyer, Iyer. And I'm going to get into that, and it's the graphic that's actually posted on the Facebook page. But at this point in time, we're going to take a listen to a couple of announcements.
This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
Georgia Southern University will present a panel examining everyday racism, examining media representations, educational disparities, and contemporary research on race and racism on Thursday, February 21st at the Beach Institute. This event is presented as part of the university's Movable Feast lecture series. For more information, visit georgiasouthern.edu/movablefeast.
Thank you for tuning in. And if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. I do have one more announcement to make, and that's coming up right now.
This portion of WRUU Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by listeners like you and Brighter Day Natural Foods. Brighter Day is celebrating its 40th year serving the Savannah community with produce, vitamins, and supplements, and a deli and juice bar. Brighter Day is located at 1102 Bull Street at the south end of Forsyth Park. More information is available at 912-236-4703 or brighterdayfoods.com.
WRUU 107.5 FM, it is a new and different, listener-supported and all-volunteer community radio for Savannah. Our diverse broadcast and web programming is supported by generous listeners who value our passion and spunk. We are independent of other media and receive no government or large corporate support. People like you are the largest and most important source of funding. Go to WRUU.org to find out how you can make a one-time or monthly contribution. Thank you. So if you just tuned in, you are listening to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and we're going to finish up listening to Dr. Jones talk about, kind of looking at this topic of race and racism through a different lens, through the stories that she's sharing with us. And when I post this as a recorded session, you'll also have the information, the link, and how to access this particular clip from the TED Talk. So I know she's giving you a lot of information and she's talking really fast, so you may have to go back and listen to this and take some notes. But I think it's very relevant to how we start looking at race and racism in this country and try to look at it through the lens from the other side. So let's continue with listening to this clip from Dr. Jones.
So we're going to interrupt the story there for a minute to say that this first part of the story tells us something about institutionalized racism, where you had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But okay, well, let's pick the story back up. Where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, now the gardener is looking at red, thinking that red is mighty beautiful. She looks over the pink flowers and she says, oh, they sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she sees that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil and she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that still goes on. And where is internalized racism in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not even understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, but of course pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee, bzzz, and then up to another pink flower, bzzz, and then it comes toward this other pink flower, and that pink flower says, get away from me, bee, do not bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in the garden? Well, let's start with addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink, right? And that's an important intervention. That's an important intervention, but as you can see, even if you do that, that's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. Or maybe you say, okay, let's deal with the personally mediated racism. So let's have a conversation with the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. So we have our workshop, and in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't, right? But even if she does, it still won't change the situation in which they find themselves. I think that if we really want to set things right in the garden, we need to address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if we want to keep separate boxes too, that's all right too, but if we do, it means that we need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when we do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious as the red. And in that intervention, we might also address the internalized racism. Pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking red is better, or wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, we also might address the personally mediated. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful will be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So, in this story, I've actually illustrated these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, and very strongly suggested that if we want to set things right, we have to address the institutionalized racism. Good if we address all the levels at the same time. But the most important question is one that I haven't raised yet, and that is, who is the gardener, right? Because the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which in my mind are the elements of self-determination. Well, who is the gardener? The gardener clearly includes government, as well as media, as well as foundations and corporations, and even communities to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink, right? And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, because she's not even really keeping the pink flowers as part of her garden. And our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Lots of different questions that can come out of this story. But I'm going to close in this last minute with one last image. And this image is not from my own real experience, but actually this is an image taken from the book by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race. And in that image, she presents racism as a conveyor belt on which people are just living their ordinary lives, not really understanding that they're moving to and through racism, but just living their ordinary lives and contributing to racism by their benign inaction. So I'm going to build on this story, get back on the conveyor belt over here, to help us know how can we act. So here we are on this crowded conveyor belt, and we're just living our lives, most of us not even paying attention or even wondering where we're going. But say one of us looks up and we see racism. Well, one reaction is to close your eyes. That's denial, right? Or another reaction is to turn around. You're still going in the same direction. Maybe you're colorblind. But if we do not, and you know what that shows you? That shows you that racism is most often passive. Most often shows up as inaction in the face of need. But if we're on this conveyor belt and we don't want to go there, then what we have to do is start walking backwards, right? And we need to walk at least as fast as it's going, not to go that way, but now we have to start walking faster if we don't want to. We really want to get away from that. And what happens when you start walking backwards on a crowded conveyor belt? You bump into people and they say, hey buddy, watch out. Where are you going? And this is your opportunity to do the first of 3 steps in terms of being actively anti-racist, and that is to name racism. You say, look, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there? And most people will say, just stop bothering me. But maybe 1 or 2 will turn around with you. So now you're 2 or 3 walking backwards on this conveyor belt. And now where are you headed? You're not just going away from racism, but now you're actually going to understand the conveyor belt motor. And now you're going to do the second of the 3 stages of anti-racism, which is to ask, how is racism operating here? And so maybe one of you thinks it's a lever, and you pick the lever up, and the belt jolts because the lever is part of it. But it's a very smart conveyor belt, so whoop, it reconfigures itself and keeps going. So now you have to do the third thing to be actively anti-racist, which is to organize and strategize to act with others who are on the other side, trying this dial or trying this button. And I believe that we together can dismantle the system and put in its place a system in which all of us can know our full potential and have the opportunity to develop to our full potential. So I have shared with you 4 allegories. Japanese lanterns talks about race as a social construct. Dual reality illustrates racism as a system that creates a 2-sided sign, a dual reality. Levels of racism illustrates 3 levels of racism and highlights the fact that if we want to set things right, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. And life on a conveyor belt motivates us to act. I hope that you've understood these stories. I hope that you'll find them useful tools, and I hope that you carry them out into the world. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that kind of sets the foundation for, how can we start looking at where we are in our places as far as talking about race and where we are in our reconciliation journey so we can get through healing, no matter which side of the fence you're on, whether you're black or you're white. It doesn't matter. If you're a person of color and you're born and raised in this country, especially as an African American, Native American, it's at what point and how do you reconcile some of the anger that obviously was demonstrated by this gentleman that talked about earlier in the incident that happened in the hotel in Portland. There's one more clip we're going to listen to. So this looks like it's going to be a 2-part show because I do want to get into the article that I've mentioned earlier about how do we get off this seesaw, because and this writer, she talks about this. This is an article dated December 30th, 2018 by Deepa, D-E-E-P-A, Iyer. She talks about this, and she talks about sustaining, this is a quote from the article, sustaining high levels of outrage, constant vigilance, and short-term cycles of rapid response is unrealistic and unhealthy for us as individuals and community members and as organizations and movements. At the same time, becoming numb, accepting what is happening as the new normal, or relying on spurts of self-care are not long-term options either. So she goes on to say, how do we get off the seesaw? How can we practice principled actions under grim circumstances? How can 2019 be a year of both risk-taking and visioning? So I'm going to leave that right there because I am going to talk about this more in the next show, next Thursday on the One Human Nation show, because I want to get this particular clip in, and it's from a comedian. And so I listened to it and I thought, well, this is a good way of looking at it too, to kind of give us a different lens and depending on where we are in the spectrum of this thing that we've created called race in how we're going to respond. So let's take a listen.
Several years ago, I went to see comedian Camara Jones perform, and as a part of his act, he did something like a racial roll call to get the crowd warmed up. So he started out and he said, "Hey, black people in the house tonight." And there was claps and cheers. And he said, "If you're black in here tonight and you're proud, I want you to put your fist in the air and yell Black Power." And all the black people in attendance, with unison and with pride, they put their fists in the air and they yelled, "Black Power." And then he said, "What about Latinos? Any Latinos in the house?" And there was claps and cheers. And he said, "If you're Latino in here tonight and you're proud, put your fist in the air and yell, Latino power." Same thing. All the Latinos in unison with pride, they put their fist in the air and yelled, Latino power. And then Kamal said, "Any white people in the house tonight?" And there was a few claps, and he said, "If you're white in here tonight and you're proud, I want you to put your fist in the air and yell, white power." And there was silence. Now, after a few seconds, there was laughter, but I'll never forget that silence. Because that choice that Kamal created in a matter of seconds, white people have been making for the last 60 years. To either be identified with racist white people who scream white power, or to be good white people and distance ourselves through silence. But that's a false moral choice. People are too messy and racism is too complex and the stakes are too high for such simplistic thinking. After the laughter died down, Kamal got serious for a second. He said something I'll never forget. He said, "White people, you gotta find better ways to speak about being white in the world, or other white people are gonna speak up for you, and they may not be the people you want representing you in the world." So I want to speak to you today about two things the kinds of white people that might be representing you in the world, and then inspiration to find your voice so that you can begin speaking back to them. I've spent big parts of my life letting other people do my thinking for me, but when I started rebelling against that silence by thinking for myself, I tapped into something powerful I was familiar with. You see, I've always been or had a rebellious spirit. Growing up, I wasn't good at sports or academics or the arts. But for as long as I can remember, I was voted class clown. So I was great at challenging authority and asking questions when I wasn't supposed to, and I loved disrupting silent spaces with humor. And since I wasn't paying attention to the lesson of the class, I had lots of time to pay attention to the people in it. And I've been people watching ever since. And it's in that same spirit that I want to encourage you today to be good troublemakers in your thinking, or what I'm calling bad white people. Now, I know some of you might already be looking for the exits in the room with all this talk about white people. Because if I've learned anything over the years, there's one thing white people hate to be called more than a racist, and it's white people, yeah. Right? I was reminded of this recently. I was tweeting about how white people needed to get better at understanding racism when a white person tweeted me, "You're one to talk." And then she went all caps, so I knew I was in trouble. "White boy?" You see, I have broken the white code of silence on naming white people as also a racial group. I was being a bad white person. So let me be clear. Yes, I am a white boy. In fact, I'm what sociologists call a really white boy. I was born in an all-white dairy farming town in upstate New York, and I grew up in mostly white suburbs, schools, and churches up the road in Union County. I've had a mullet. I wear flip-flops in the winter. I play frisbee golf, and yes, I let dogs kiss me on the mouth. But when I talk about whiteness today, I don't just mean having white skin. I mean what James Baldwin meant when he said that our identities are like clothes that we wear to cover the nakedness of the self. You see, we don't just have races, we wear them to make sense of ourselves and the world. And like clothing, we sometimes grow accustomed to the fabric and we forget that we're wearing them. So if you're non-white here today, we need you too. Because more often than not, you can see how we're wearing our whiteness better than we can. So I want to encourage all of us today to wear our whiteness robes loosely so that we might see them and feel them for what they are and ourselves for what we might become. Because as Baldwin says, it's trust in one's nakedness is all that gives one the power to change one's robes. Now, since we're being class clowns in our thinking, I want to use a typical classroom as a metaphor for looking at the robes of whiteness. And I want to encourage all of you to sit in the back of the room and be willing to look with new eyes. Be willing to challenge those voices speaking for you. And be looking for your own voice along the way. Now, the first characters you are familiar with, white bullies. Now, bullies wear their whiteness to try to cover their badness in the world, to try to make themselves feel better than others. They practice a more violent version of what comedians call punching down, taking the easy way out by attacking those below them, avoiding the hard work of finding themselves or punching up at the violence that produced them. You see, racism is ultimately a sickness of the soul. So white bullies from the KKK to internet trolls, they wear whiteness like a mask, hiding from themselves in order to hurt others. But not only do bullies attack easy targets, but they are triggered by those who threaten to expose their smallness in the world. Like many of you, I've been inspired by the protests we've seen around the world in recent years, and when I've spoken up about the love and the courage I saw in the faces of the protesters from our city, facing off with an army of police and soldiers armed with tear gas and guns and tanks, I had forgotten about the bully rule of punching down. But white people from my past quickly reminded me, confused and angry, that I would also be outraged at injustice and inspired by the protesters. You see, I was being a bad. What bothered me about bullies was that instead of dealing with their pain through friendship, they took it out on the rest of us. And it's the same with white bullies today. Their anger is real, it just isn't true. And they're mailing that anger in to the wrong address, and there's a multi-billion-dollar outrage industry on YouTube, talk radio, and political platforms waiting to cash in the checks of white anger. And this isn't new. In fact, white anger has been big business in America since our founding. It's what historians call the wages of whiteness, where working-class whites traded in their pain and anger for the temporary relief of feeling bigger than their black and brown neighbors. But it's bad business. Fear and anger are two of our most primal emotions, so we should guard them vigilantly. The fact that people are profiting off your pain without a peep about love or solidarity, that should raise some flags. In fact, if you want something to be angry about, there's a start. Now, because bullies have often worn their whiteness loudest in the world, they've often received the most attention, but it's really been white hall monitors, standing quietly in the front of the class, taking names who played the larger role in the history of whiteness. So whereas bullies wear whiteness to feel good, hall monitors wear whiteness to get goods. These are goods white people, but here goodness is not about the character of the person, but about making good deals. It's replacing the golden rule with the rule of gold, and the way you get goods as a hall monitor is not by being your brother's keeper, but by keeping your brother out. Whiteness here is worn like a stiff-collared shirt. President Eisenhower explained this. Speaking about white Southern parents during desegregation, he said, "These are not bad people. All they're concerned about is that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside some big black bucks." The emphasis there is not on the hatred of the black students, but on the goods for the sweet little girls. You see, when your goodness is confused with goods, your world becomes like a game of Monopoly, and your neighbor just another piece on the board. All space becomes your space, all time, your time, all goods, your goods. The hall monitor ethic says, we're going to destroy your neighborhood to build a highway through it, but not because we hate you, but because we love short commutes. Or we're going to give you subprime loans for your house, but not because we hate you, because we love high interest rates. Or we're going to build our own schools, taking the best teachers and resources, not because we hate your children, but because of our sweet little girls. And there's a common thread connecting hall monitors of the past saying you can't vote yet, get an education now, or eat in my restaurant, to the hall monitors of today, policing people walking down my streets, barbecuing in my park, kneeling during my anthem. This is not about hatred, it's about goods. As a class clown who largely saw school as a place to laugh and make friends, I couldn't stand hall monitors. I could handle bullies because at least I could understand them, but I could never understand the motivation of a kid turning a place of joy into a place of law and order. And the gag is, hall monitors police white people too. I've heard white hall monitors call poor and working class whites ignorant and lazy. Ironically, the same slurs bullies use for other races. Now, I come from working class people, who to this day are some of the smartest, hardest working people I know. So I was offended because, again, I realized I was a bad white person.
I'm going to have to stop this right here, but we will pick this up on the next show to finish out, because it really gets into how to start looking at where we are in our race reconciliation journey with a different lens, and being able to look at the other side of the coin, because in order for us to have communication and safe, honest, open dialogues, to see a change and to be the healing, we have to really dig deep. And we're just starting in 2019. And so I'm hoping to give you some tools kicking off the year in how to dig deep. So we're going to come back to the article that I mentioned before, because it really, if you're already in the trenches, it really gives you some tools to manage the stress. If you haven't put your feet all the way in yet, or you're contemplating it, it's really good to understand, kind of what is your role going to be. So as we wrap up today's One Human Nation show and get ready for Sound Limits with Troy Stoner, I do want to let you know that, of course, this show is going to be uploaded to the Facebook page so that you can listen to it. There's also a podcast that goes with this as part of the recording, as well as iTunes, as well as a YouTube channel for the One Human Nation show. So, this is how we learn. This is how we can hopefully all do what we can do in our space. And as you go through this week, remember the question that I asked at the beginning of the show. If you're a white person, how would your life be different if you were born and raised in this country as an African American? And on the flip side of that, if you are a black person, how would your life be different if you were born and raised as a white person? What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages? And take a look around about where you are in your day-to-day surroundings. Once again, thank you for listening to the One Human Nation show. Troy Stoner is in the house, and he's all tuned up for Sound Limits. Hello, Troy. So I'm going to sign out. You have a great week, and take care of yourself.